All right, hey, welcome everyone. Doug Seefelt, I'm the research director for the Digital Scholarship Lab here at Ball State University, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Matthias Reis, who is going to talk to us about personality and language of German Twitter users in his linguistic and computational analysis with R study. Matthias says that he likes to communicate data stories. And I think that's a wonderful thing. A lot of times we think about data as simply propping up or illustrating an argument or something like that. But in these data are stories. They're stories that we can tell as a historian, as a linguist, as anything. And so there are obviously quite a bit of technical skills and training that Matthias has undergone to be able to get at these stories and tell them to us. He successfully defended his dissertation in linguistics and will be walking in May of this year with a doctorate and a graduate certificate in statistical modeling. Currently, he's working with us in the DSL as a data science consultant, and he's looking for a real bright future, I'm sure, after graduation. He's been really busy, besides his dissertation, working on other projects. He's got a German Twitter Explorer dashboard and a hospital-related infections dashboard. So again, telling stories with big data. He's had over 3 years of coding experience building statistical models with R. He did a workshop for us just a few weeks ago. He's really experimenting with designing these hypothesis testing and running all kinds of different statistical inquiry. He's got interest in machine learning and working with what we've found to be a delightful way of working with teams and of scholars and other participants in projects. So please join me in welcoming Matthias. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to dive right into it because we got a bunch of stuff to get through. This is essentially an amended version of my dissertation defense, sans all 22 hypotheses. Because, I mean, I'm not going to, reading this stuff, that just takes a lot of time. So why do you even get into a topic like that? Because I wanted to illuminate the threefold interaction between language, demographics, and personality. The significance comes essentially from that because, one, it's novel. It's not been done in that form before. German as a language, especially on Twitter or social media, is highly understudied. So this study answers the call for further research in that arena. The way I did it, and you will see this later in the methodology, is you get more reliable demographic information. It comes at a cost, but I'll get into that. So my study also adds to the low-ish number of social media studies. There's a ton of stuff now that's available, but it's very much, like I said, very much centered around English, especially American English, because, I mean, that's where most of those companies are from. The method is fairly new or novel, as you will see, and I was interested in finding interesting insights and thus also expanding sociolinguistic research. So the theoretical framework is also essentially threefold. The linguistics portion is mostly sociolinguistics and corpus linguistics. Corpus linguistics because I had to build my own Twitter corpus, right? Twitter does not allow researchers to share collected data because they want to make money off of you, and that's why you have to either collect your own data or buy it from a company. Psychology, especially personality research, and the Big Five factor model. I'm sure some of you've heard of it. It's it's the gold standard for personality assessment. The reason I used it, I'm going to come back to that in the methodology as well, is because the original version of this assessment had, I think, 246 items, the Neo-PIR. We're now down to 10. So you get 2 items per personality trait, and it's been shown to work very, very well, right? The reliability is very high. And if you're planning any kind of study where you try to collect data online, then you have to make sure that you keep it as short as possible, because people, they don't want to spend a lot of time, taking surveys. So in the BFI-10, the 10-item inventory can be completed in like 30 seconds or something. The second part is essentially, this is where linguistics comes in, is language and gender, especially perceived stereotypes that go back. I mean, Coates, Tannen, and Holmes were among the first to investigate how men and women talk differently or use language differently. Some of it has been amended because it's been shown not to be true, right? So with novel data collection methods and an extended amount of data also comes the responsibility of amending previous research. The other thing is the analysis of language at the word level. And what that means, I'm going to get to also in the methodology. Pennebaker and King Jemmy Pennebaker is at UT Austin. He wrote a book on how pronouns define and are related to personality types, right? So, which is something we thought is not very, especially as a linguist, you're like, well, context matters. Now we have to say, well, it depends, because previously we only had so much data, but if you have, I don't know, a corpus of 1 billion interactions or 1 billion words, then all of a sudden you see that pronouns can have meaning. Stuff that you usually would just filter out for content words, like nouns or verbs. The other conceptual part is Twitter-related research, especially multilingual Twitter. And some scholars have shown that, especially Hong et al. Have shown that language does matter on Twitter. We would expect Spanish to be the second most used language on Twitter, but that's actually not the case. I think it used to be Spanish, and I think it's now something else. And then, interestingly enough, Japanese was up in the top 5. German didn't even make it in the top 10, I don't think, right? Which we'll come back later and see why that is. Then hashtags, so there's research into hashtags, a good amount of it, especially what types and functions there are in a tweet. So I'm also going to get more into detail about that. And then hashtags and gender. So is there gender use of hashtags, essentially? And then, of course, emojis. Everybody knows emojis now, right? It's actually a compound of 2 Japanese words, and it means picture character. So they actually been around quite a while, and I think the first use of, and emojis are kind of the grown-up version of an emoticon, right? And there's really interesting research on that itself. For example, we in the Western world, we usually write emojis or used to write emoticons horizontally, right? It turns out in Asian countries it's actually vertically, right? And that, I mean, that's just something that's I think Tyler Schnöbelen wrote his dissertation on emoticon-related research, and he found that it even makes a difference if people put the nose in the emoticon or leave it out. So there's, I mean, then again, I mean, you all know that if you just dig long enough, you'll find something. And then, of course, personality research, language and personality. Alpert and Oppert, as early as 1936, found that there's a very important link between personality types and language. Out of their research, the Big 5 factor model was actually developed. So it went through several stages, and I think the first version came about sometime in the 1970s, maybe. Luke is an important concept. It's short for linguistic inquiry and word count. I'm going to also come back to that later. It was developed by Pennebaker and King, and it's essentially a word count software, but I'm going to tell you about that later as well. And then there's, of course, early and recent studies on language and personality where they kind of bring it together. Iaconi 2010 and Buck et al. 2010, they, for example, they looked at language and personality in Facebook posts. So those would be examples of studies that have been done involving social media data in particular. It's important to know that the social media aspect is fairly new. The personality and language aspect is not very new, right? There's a lot of research on that, especially lab-based research. Pennebaker, for example, they let psychology students write diaries and then analyze them with linguistic inquiry and word count. And what Pennebaker has found is that writing, he's a psychologist, so writing helps a lot with overcoming trauma. And that's something they use to further the research into the connection between language, and especially at the word level, and personality types. So some important key concepts, like I said, linguistic inquiry and word count. So how does that look? It's essentially a dictionary-based software. And it has a ton of stuff. The output gives you a ton of information, and you could feed anything that's text, you could feed into it as long as it's clean enough. And it will give you, among other things, it will give you counts or percentages on over 76 word categories. And it will give you the percentage of that category in that document. Okay, so that means you could put a text in, and then it'll give you the percentage of positive emotion words in that text, or the percentage of positive feeling words. I put those two because it turns out that was very important in my dissertation, that distinction. Since this thing is dictionary based, you have to, of course, have a German Luke dictionary if you want to use German as a language. Luckily enough, there was a guy who worked with Pennebaker. Actually, he was at the. Yeah. Do you have a question? Yeah.
How did they distinguish between the emotion word and the feeling word?
That's what I'm going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
And in the latest version of Luke, I think that's 2015. This distinction is actually not being made anymore. It turns out that positive feeling words is, you can already tell that it's semantically very closely related to positive emotion words. In the German version of the dictionary, it's just still present because they haven't updated it yet. But the guy who wrote the German Luke dictionary, I talked to him, and he said, you could find statistically significant findings in any of those two, because this one is a subcategory of that one. And now in the newer versions of Luke, they just put it together, right? So you don't have to. But in my case, it turned out to be important. Then, of course, emojis. This graph comes from Novak et al. 2015. What they did is they took at the time, a very big emoji set, I think 751, and sentiment ranked them. Right? So going through 0, which is neutral, up until +1, which is very positive, and down to -1, which is like the most negative ones. And then you get a sentiment ranking for individual emojis. This is, of course, this is also a little outdated, but you can only use what you have. We have now 2,300 emojis, right? And this was at a time, you see that this is still the Simpsons yellow, right? This was at a time when emojis had not been split up into the Fitzpatrick scale, where you have individual skin tones. I can also, if you have a question about it, I can also talk about how that makes it computationally more difficult, because you have a Unicode code point for an emoji, and then you have another Unicode code point that gives it the skin tone. And filtering stuff out can make that fairly complex. Then, of course, here we have the Big Five scale. Those are the 5 factors, essentially, and this is how a participant profile essentially would look like. I just made this rows chart because it's very easy to see what the highest trait is, what the lowest trait is, et cetera, et cetera. So you can never say that you're only an extrovert or you're only high on openness. It's always going to be a combination of those 5 factors. And all of them come with their own problems and benefits, right? If you're very high on agreeableness, then you're more likely to be a pushover, right? If you're very low on agreeableness, then you're probably a CEO. There's solid research on that. By the way, and this is interesting in the gender respect, by the way, because we have this issue that women don't get promoted, et cetera, right? Or there's a glass ceiling. research has actually shown that the women who are in CEO positions are very low in agreeableness. Just like the men who are in very high positions are low in agreeableness. So it's not only gender, it's actually, it's not a univariate problem, it's a multivariate problem, right? Another important concept, like I said, hashtags, right? If you have hashtags at the end of a tweet or a Facebook post, they tend to be commentary hashtags. That means they comment on the content of the text body, right? Now we even see tweets that don't even have a text body, they only consist of hashtags, right? That could be a single word, it could also be a phrase, right? Which makes them fairly complex. But you can see that this is actually commenting on the tweet itself, right? Of course, those can also, as we will see now, they can also be, especially in the final position, they can just be tag hashtags. Tag hashtags were the first hashtags to be introduced. A guy, Messina, actually in 2007, shortly after Twitter took off, he, in a blog post, somehow haphazardly said, you know what, why don't we use hashtags to index tweets? Computer scientists, they use hashtags to essentially comment on code in a script, right? In this case, this essentially just creates a hyperlink and indexes it, and that way you can make sure that your tweet becomes part of a bigger audience and a bigger movement or topic, right? In this case, this is what I meant earlier when we talk about the function of a tweet, of a hashtag within a tweet, right? If it's in mid position, so to say, it's very likely that it's actually part of the syntax. So if you take the hash symbol away, it's just a noun or a verb, right? Which is very, very important for linguistic analysis, because then essentially all you have to do is you delete the hash symbol and then you have a complete sentence, okay? I'm going to give you 3 of my hypotheses, those because they're representative of kind of what this whole thing is about, and then you can see that it doesn't make sense to read all 22 to you. So the first would be, and this is a representation of how personality is related to those word categories. So there will be a significant positive correlation between an extroverted personality, so high on extroversion, and the percentage of positive emotion words, right? And that is why that subcategory essentially built a little roadblock for me, as we'll see later, because my finding wasn't significant for positive emotion words, but it was significant for positive feeling words, right? And now, in the new version, had there been a new version of the German dictionary, it would have just been significant for that one category. There will be a significant prediction of the sentiment score by extroversion, based on the assumption that if you're more extroverted, you tend to be a happier person or more outgoing, right? So based on the assumption, you use more emojis. And there will be a significant prediction of positive emotion words by gender. That, of course, makes sense because that's one of the common stereotypes, that women use more positive emotion words, etc., compared to males, right? Good. Methodology. I set this up to be essentially 100% quantitative because I already knew I wanted to go into data science, and that way it's a lot easier to argue for your points if you have data to support them. Not everybody will agree with that statement, but I'm fine with that. Similar methodologies that use Twitter in the Big Five. He et al., especially the sampling, they use snowball sampling. That's the same thing I did, because in our day and age, it's a lot easier to essentially have your social media network essentially, retweet or repost your survey link, right? It's completely legit. It works fairly well because you don't have to infringe upon other people's rights, right? So I didn't go to my friend's timeline and post it there. I shared it with them and asked them to post it. And whoosh, the responsibility is off of you. Kuefner et al.'s age bracket, I used the same age bracket, 18 to 45, which is a pretty representative age bracket for social media users. Although I'm not saying that there's no 55-year-olds or 60-year-olds who use Twitter. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'm going to go over this fairly quickly because I said some of it already. Luke was invented or written by Pennebaker and King. The original dictionary is based on 6,400 words. in 74 categories, and you just essentially you put the input in, and then you get a percentage per word category. Schwartz et al. Actually said that Luke is the most widely used language analysis tool, and Mehl et al. Actually called it like the gold standard for psychology-based language analysis. So what is Twitter? Everybody knows Twitter, but I'm going to give you a bunch of information that you probably didn't know. It's a microblogging platform. It is non-reciprocal, which makes it unique in that sense. You don't have to follow somebody back. And I don't know how you use Twitter. I usually use it just for information retrieval. I retweet stuff, and I'm sure there's a lot more prolific people out there that write more tweets, but I usually I just use it to follow stuff, right? What are current developments in data science or linguistics, or etc. It started out with 140 characters. They actually doubled it now. I don't know if that's going to make or break Twitter. I think they did it to make it. But the whole point when they started was to write short messages and to be concise. And actually, I think there's actually studies that showed that people have gotten way more concise, right? So language adjusts to the medium, and then you see that, you know, when even during the old days, the older people say, young people, they're just butchering language. And now we're saying the same thing about millennials and how they just butcher language and don't use it right. But we've actually found that they don't butcher language at all. They just adjust to the medium, right? There are 800 million users. 313 are active. So that means 800 million users only have an account. We have about 500 million tweets per day, which is an insanely high number. I told Steph and Jim about this, I think. To put this in perspective, that's 6,000 tweets per second. This fills a 25 million page book, which is almost 20,400 copies of Tolstoy's War and Peace, which is a pretty hefty book. It would take 77 years to read it, right? So that's just, you know. The face with tears of joy is the most tweeted emoji with 14.5 billion in 2016. It's still the most tweeted emoji. And there are 12 million German Twitter users. That's another reason why I did this study, because for Twitter, there's a lot of room for improvement for the German user base, or for, you know. Okay, so I got 62 participants, 33 women, 29 males. As you see, age is pretty, one, it's pretty normally distributed. Two, there's no significant difference between the ages, which is good, right? Not that most statistical techniques are not robust, but it's always good to have a somewhat, you know, similar distribution. I achieved a fairly good spread across Germany. You can, by the density plots or lines, you can see that, of course, most people cluster around like bigger metropolitan areas like Munich, and then you have Cologne and Dortmund, and then you have Berlin, which is its own little pocket, in Hamburg, right? So, but there's pretty good spread across Germany overall, which is, I mean, I'm not one to claim that this is a representative sample, but it's definitely better than a lab sample, because, yeah.
Well, do you have to worry about the people who use Twitter might be different than people who do not?
Oh, there certainly are.
And so your conclusions just then get limited to Twitter users?
Yeah, I mean that's inherent in the study, right? So you get a random sample from the Twitter using population, because it's not a comparative study between people who use Twitter and who don't use Twitter.
But you might get an overload, say, of extroverts on Twitter, and the introverts say, why bother, you know, totally uninterested. Or openness to experience, yes, I'm going to use Twitter, but if you're low on openness, you wouldn't. So I guess...
I see where you're coming from. I
mean, I understand that you're limiting it to Twitter users, but...
There's actually two hypotheses on this. There's one is called the rich get richer hypothesis, that says extroverts who use social media, they get more extroverted through it. And then there's a second hypothesis that says the social compensation hypothesis, that says introverts use social media because then they don't have to directly interact with people, right? And factoring both of those in, that then puts it in a different light. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I have yet to find a study that's not in some way at least a little biased, right? Okay, and then this is the amount of time females and males spend on Twitter in minutes, and you see that it's fairly equal, right? Fairly equal amounts of time spent on Twitter. Females are a little higher on the high end, but that's almost negligible. So there was no statistical significant difference. And then here we have the big 5 traits, and as expected, you see women are a little higher on agreeableness and on openness. So, and then I ran an ANOVA on it to confirm this, which showed that yes, very low p-value that shows that gender is a significant predictor essentially of the score, of the personality score, and the personality factor, so agreeableness, openness, etc., is also a significant predictor of the score. Now, the omega squared values are fairly low, right? That means there is a significant finding, but the effect is fairly small, which means that you have to be careful taking that at face value. And please, if you have any questions, don't feel, you can always just interrupt. Here, this is fairly interesting because my pipeline was also a little more complex than I expected in the beginning when I set this thing up, as is the case. So, and I started way bigger than it should have been. So it started out with the collection of tweets via the Twitter API. I then apply a language filter to only get German tweets. This then leads to individual Twitter microcorpora per participant. They then get cleaned. The NTN stands for noisy text normalization, and I'll show you an example of what that actually means. I then use a package called Corpus to tag the tweets and to get 2 measures, Yule's K and type token ratio, and those are just measures for vocabulary richness, right? So do men write tweets or do females write tweets that are more vocabulary rich than the other side, essentially? And then, so you get a tweet text only corpus, like that's just clean tweets, and that you feed into linguistic inquiry and word count. That's very important because otherwise you don't get accurate results from linguistic inquiry and word count. A second route then led to tweets with hashtags. That was a subset. And the third route that led to tweets with emojis, and then based on those tweets, the sentiment scores were calculated for those tweets. The 3 routes are necessary because you can't do everything with the same subset.
Before you move on, I have a question about how you define German tweets. Because is it just tweets that are using the German language from all over the world? Is it tweets that only originate in Germany? And then also you can declare like where you're tweeting from, but like you can say that you're in a place that you aren't. So what are you using as your like boundary?
Yeah, well, so this is an important question. One, in 2014, Twitter made geotagging opt-in. Right, so we get if you get a random sample, less than 1% of tweets will now be geotagged, which is a pain for researchers, but it's good for people's privacy, I guess.
It's good for people who are in a country that they aren't allowed to.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, one way I made sure that the tweets only originated from Germany and not, for example, from Austria or Switzerland, because I mean that's technically those are also German Twitter users. Is I only sent the sampling was only done in Germany, and I collected the plots on the map that you saw. They're based on zip codes. Okay. So I mean, there's only so much you can do, right? And that's a very important question, but you have to draw the line somewhere. So if the zip code was within Germany, then I proceeded with the assumption that that person was in fact tweeting from Germany. But you're right, some Germans actually do tweet in English or French or Spanish, whatever. What is that? CLDR is a package that uses Google Chrome's language detection. Okay, so and then if if you input something, then it spits out a probability of that tweet being German or English, etc. And then you can say, and then you can just use that label, right? And that's what I did. Of course, you get some false positives, of course, and then you lose some tweets or you win some tweets that you're not supposed to. But because you could have a tweet that's like half-half, right? And what do you do then? So you have to decide, I'll take it or I don't take it. And I said, if it's not 100% German, I don't want it, right? Because it would dilute the analysis to some extent. And then also, if you feed it into Luke, you might not get accurate results if that's something that happens frequently. So, noisy text normalization. This is a tweet, and it says the emoji is so cute, etc., right? So, if you feed this into Luke, then it's just gonna break, right? Or it's gonna spit out crap. So, what you want is this. No elongations, no hashtag symbols, no URLs, no hashtags at the end, no ad mentions, which is something that happens all the time, no emojis, right? So that was the ultimate output for Luke, only for the Luke analysis. And that's what noisy text normalization means. You clean the text up so it doesn't essentially distort your analysis. Here we get the overall tweet sample, close to 20,000. And this is what I meant at the beginning when I said getting richer demographic information comes at a cost, right? It's very easy to get millions of tweets now, but you won't get the rich demographic information that you get when you combine the tweet sample with a Qualtrics survey, and also that's what I wanted. So we see, interestingly, in the 36 to 45-year age group, the males are definitely leading the pack, whereas in the 25 to 35-year-old, it's the females, right? And this is going to be important later for the findings. The males overall produced a little more tweets than the females, and then this is almost negligible. This is also an interesting finding, which shows that very young people actually moving away from media like Twitter and Facebook and moving towards Instagram and Snapchat, right? But they don't have a good API. There's however a trick, since if you collect tweets through Twitter, you actually get the source, right? You know how some people have their Instagram linked up with Twitter, and they write on Instagram, but it gets posted on Twitter. So you could essentially filter the tweet set for tweets that only come from Instagram, and then you get a proxy Instagram sample. I would assume you would have to collect more data, but that would be a good way to essentially get a different social media. I included this plot in the dissertation because it's a very apt representation of how natural data actually looks like, and it's not anywhere normally distributed. Unlike any stats book claims, you see that there's like a good amount of outliers. You see that there's very, very big differences here in the age group, and then you have overlap here, so that's not too bad. But you do have those outliers of very prolific Twitter users, right? That just, I don't know, they write a ton of tweets every day, whereas somebody else, I mean, I didn't mention this, but when you collect tweets from an individual, it gets capped at 3,200. Which means that for somebody who is not very prolific, you could essentially get a tweet sample that spans 5 years, whereas for somebody else, you could only get a half year. Like you could only get 6 months, right? And this is kind of is represented here in this outlier-ish behavior. Question? Yes.
Now along the y-axis, you have the number of tweets. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, never mind. I see.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and then this is the hashtag hand coding. That was a pain. From the subset of tweets containing hashtags, that was roughly 8,000. I got a random sample of I think 1,600, and then I hand coded the hashtags in them. And that means I coded them for hashtag language. Was the hashtag in German or English? That was something I allowed, right? Because even if you write the tweet in German, you might want it to be part of a bigger movement. So was it in English or German? was it a tag or a commentary hashtag? Right? Did it comment on the text, or was it just a tag hashtag to link it to something? And was the hashtag in the beginning, the middle, i.e. part of the syntax, or at the end? Which would be, let's say the end position is the canonical position. That's where you would expect the hashtag to be. And this is what I found. You see this age group, 25 to 35-year-olds, use the most hashtags, that's not too surprising. And then the end position is favored above all else, right? And I'm going to give you more insight when I get to the actual analysis.
Did you expect more commentary?
No. Yeah, so the end position is canonical and tag is also canonical, right? The reason being that a commentary hashtag is usually longer and can have its own syntax, which is why it can replace an entire tweet. Or you get, I don't know, people post an emoji and then use a commentary hashtag that's like 5 words long. And then I'm like, why didn't you just write a tweet? But no, I mean, honestly, especially since a commentary hashtag is not searchable, right? You can't unless it's something that's right. I mean, if you're a woman and you tweet, like you say hashtag we're not incapable, right? That's a phrase and that's searchable because it's very prevalent and it's been used a lot. But if the average Joe comes up with their own commentary hashtag, it's very unlikely that that's going to be a trending hashtag, right? So this actually I only included the top 5, I think, in my presentation for my dissertation, but I put all top 15 here because I think it's very interesting. Like I said, the face with tears of joy was definitely leading the pack for both genders. But then we find there's some very interesting differences, right? So the smiling face with heart eyes was number 3 for males and number 4 for females, and you would definitely I would have expected it to be the other way around. Then we have the flexed bicep for the females, and that actually, as you will see later, doesn't actually occur at all for the males. Right, which I mean that, and given the current movement, etc., it's not too surprising. It's just something that you wouldn't expect when you start out. So, which is good. I mean, that's another thing that validates what I've done, and you can see that that people actually do behave the way we see every day. Face blowing a kiss, I think that was higher for the females. Or was it? Maybe it wasn't even in there.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, it's not even in there. So that's something, why are the men blowing kissy faces around? I don't know.
Another dissertation.
Yeah. That exactly. The hypothesis. No, the question is, why are men blowing kissy faces on social media?
On the female side, are you showing in position 10? Is there a tie, or is it?
That's a tie.
Being used together?
That's a tie, and that's a good question, because since I got done, my computational skills have actually grown. And what now would be very interesting to look at is what emojis commonly occur together in a row.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
right?
almost like an emoji diphthong.
Yes, exactly. Well, exactly. And since people are now sending entire messages that only consist of emojis, mm-hmm. right? So yeah, but I didn't have the skills back then. Now I could do that, but don't have the time actually right now. So yeah, and then you have 2 hearts winking and 2 hearts in the winking face. That was interesting to me, right? For both genders, the heart is at the same rank, but it's a green heart for guys and a red heart for women. And if you look at, so this is interesting because it's so varied, mm-hmm. and it doesn't follow any prescribed roles, essentially, right? You don't have all the guy emojis on one side and all the girl emojis on the other side. No, it's completely mixed. And I think that's a good thing, and it shows that you can use whatever you want, right? As a guy, you're not it's not a bad thing to use the kissy face emoji, right? Just like it's completely okay to use a flex bicep for a girl. And maybe 20 years ago, if we had emojis, that would have been the other way around, right? Yeah, that's it. And then you have like, they go down and then, but I think the only real overlap was the hearts and the face with tears of joy. And that was interesting to see because everything else that was just like, crossed. Okay, let's see.
I'm interested to know if you've seen other research that explores emoji prevalence on different types of, in different contexts. So for instance, text messaging and how different emojis might be used on Twitter versus in text messaging.
Like I said, Tyler Schnurblin, he did his dissertation on emoticons.
Okay.
And I think he mentions gender because he also did something sociolinguistic-y. But I think it's very far and few between simply because collecting data from cell phones in text form is so difficult.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, where would you, I think that's such a pain to set this up.
Yeah, NSA will do it for you.
Yeah. No, I mean, exactly. And I think Sally Tallimonte at UT Toronto, she has done something with cell phones. But it's an IRB nightmare.
Sure.
And I think then what she had people do is they installed an app on their phone, and you have to sign 1 million consent forms, and then that app essentially collects the messages and then collects them on some sort of database or server. So it's possible, but
Sure.
I'm not aware of any study that particularly focused on text messages. Yeah.
I'd be interested to see the demographics for like your sexuality or like how you consider your own gender. I mean, what you were talking about, like pronouns and how those would appear in the tweets. And so if people find themselves to be a little bit more fluid on that spectrum, perhaps that's also why some of these emojis are a little surprising because it corresponds with a community that's very represented and very comfortable on Twitter and may not be as prevalent or noticeable in the general public.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're in for a treat because the story continues.
Okay.
You will see later. Okay, so then those are the sentiment scores that are calculated, like we said, based on the emojis, right? So this is based on the subset of tweets that had at least one emoji, and then was given the sentiment score that the emoji had from Novak et al.'s study. If they had more than one emoji, then it was the average for that tweet. Now this is very nice because it's kind of, it's the ups and downs through the years, right? It's very high in August when everybody's happy, and then crap, I have to go back to work. Yeah, it picks up again towards Christmas. It's like, yeah, holiday season.
So what does the sentiment score mean then? What is the higher number? What does that indicate?
It ranges from -1, negative, via 0, that's neutral, and then +1 is very positive. Yeah. So this is a nice representation, but this is based on all the tweets that have an emoji, right? As soon as you break it down by gender, boom, it's the guys that are the drag.
I've got a question
Yes,
for Matthias. What year were you collecting this? So is this like an election year in Germany, or were there specific events going on that might have taken this into account?
That's a very good methodological question. When you collect tweets only from individuals, right? You know the individual that you want to collect tweets from. What I did, I waited until I had all my participants. I had all their the questionnaires, and they supplied their Twitter handle. So I just had to then add those handles, and I collected all the tweets in one day.
Oh, right.
Because
this is one day. No.
The data doesn't represent one day, but I'm streaming individual participants, and so I don't have to collect tweets for like 12 months. Right. So because when you collect tweets from an individual, you only get 3,200.
So as you said before, some of them are a couple of years, some of them are much longer.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's several Januaries.
Exactly. What I had to make sure was that I collected everybody's tweets at the same day, so everybody had the same cutoff. Does that make sense? It could go back further for some people than others, but going forward, nobody had more tweets than other people. Does that make sense? Yeah. If you stream a topic, right, or you want to collect tweets on a hashtag, then you would set it up in a way that you collect over 2 weeks, right? Because you're then interested in a specific hashtag. Yeah. Okay. But I wasn't interested in a particular hashtag.
That's right. Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
So, and then we see the big dip. That's actually the guys, right? And the females are pretty consistent throughout the year, and those are the ones that drive the pickup towards the end of the year, right? And then if you break it down by age groups, it's even more ridiculous. It's like the older curmudgeons ruin it for everybody. And then this is, of course, this is due to lack of data in that age group, right? I don't think that that's an actual pattern, but there's fewer data points in this particular quadrant, essentially. But you still see that the females are pretty consistent. The younger ones not so much, but the 25 to 35-year-olds pretty consistent. And the guys have a lot more variation in the happiness, essentially.
Is there a reason why you didn't graph these with 2 lines in one graph, so that the blue and the pink are overlapping each other? I think that might be a better way to tell your story.
Well, I mean, yeah,
that way you
like that, but also with age included.
No, just like those don't need to be 2 separate graphs, because you're visually, when you look at this, you only see one y-axis. You don't know that it's 2 graphs that are stacked on top of each other.
Yeah.
And so it reads as if all of the men's scores are higher than it reads that they start out at like 0.7 and are going higher.
I see what you mean.
Yeah,
okay,
so,
yeah.
So if you graphed both those on the same axis,
like just like down here, for example.
So they'd be. You could see the divergence. You can see when they cross over.
That would absolutely be possible.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually a pretty good tip. Yeah, and then you could still do by age.
Yep.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. I don't know. Just
I mean, the only drawback is if in your weak sample for older women, you may not want to conflate those.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we get to the findings. This is what I talked about earlier. The hypothesis, remember, said there's a significant relationship between positive feelings, positive emotion words, and extroversion, and what I found was the same positive relationship between positive feeling words. And so the hypothesis is essentially confirmed by proxy. If you factor in that positive feeling words is a subcategory of the overall positive emotion words category. And then we only have another positive finding, significant finding for anxiety and neuroticism. And both of those findings are very much confirmed in existing research, right? Which is this makes you happy because it shows that one, previous research is good and is valid, and that you're doing something right. If everything is negative or everything is the opposite, then you know that's a red flag. Sentiment scores. So this is what I already told you. So the subset brings down the participant number some, which shows that not everybody actually used emojis. And then in terms of the analysis, I'm going to just put this all there. I had to use a linear mixed effects regression model simply because if you have 45 participants, right, they all write more than one tweet, which that violates the assumption of independence, and then you have to account for that in your model. Interestingly, so extroversion, that's confirmed, affected the sentiment score significantly, meaning that it increases by 0.04 on average with every point increase for extroversion, right? So, which confirms that extroverted people are somewhat happier, or at least seem to be happier based on the emojis they use. Neuroticism did not affect the sentiment score, which that's also something you would usually expect, especially given the finding that neuroticism is significantly linked to positive feeling or anxiety words. But that again shows that not everything is as clear-cut as we would like it to be sometimes. And then gender is significant, which means that on average, switching from male to female, the sentiment score increases by 0.07, which is also, by the way, that's something that's found cross-culturally and across age groups, that females are happier than males, which might also lead to a longer life. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. Yeah, but I mean that was again one of those findings where, like, yes, that's been previously shown. I can just add to existing knowledge. Age was not significant, which that might be interesting for some people. Who's like, why is age not significant, right? Usually you would expect younger people to use way more emojis, but I think given Twitter's age, we're now at a time where this doesn't hold true anymore, right? Because the following generations, they don't have a drop in emoji use. They have an increase. And if you remember the age bracket 18 to 45, then we totally have an age bracket that's, when Twitter started, those people were starting to use emojis. So if they're 45 now, that doesn't mean that they simply stop using emojis, right? Here we see this is just the table output, and I put this in because it nicely shows what happens when you look at the individual hashtag positions. Okay, remember we said the end position is the canonical position. Okay, and look what happens if you look at the middle position. The reference category is the beginning position. Right, that's just how I did it in R. So switching from the beginning position to the middle position increases the probability of that being a tag hashtag by 479%. Why? I mean, if you think about it linguistically, that absolutely makes sense, because you can include a single word in the syntax a lot easier than a commentary hashtag, right? And then this is also interesting, the number of characters in a hashtag, right? The longer it becomes, right? The longer the hashtag becomes, for every character increase, the likelihood of that being a commentary hashtag increases by 19%. And that's a lot lower than 479% for the middle position, but it shows that the hashtag length is definitely important for tagging or commenting, right? Which that's also another good finding, because it shows that my assumptions were correct. And then here we have Twitter measures in emoji density, and it's fairly simple. Emoji density is essentially just the percentage of tweets that contain at least one emoji. So, and you can calculate that fairly quickly for each participant. Now, the assumption was that it's significant for gender, right? My assumption was that females have a higher emoji density, but that wasn't true. What was very significant, again, extroverted people have a higher emoji density. Okay, this output is a lot to take in, and that's because it's the output of a generalized additive model. And I'll show you a plot because that's a lot easier. They are actually able to model non-linear relationships, that can be very important when you look at natural data, because a lot of natural data actually don't follow a straight line; they have like curvature. So if you look at it, you see that there is in fact a curvature for age. And then even though, which is why visual analysis is so important, even though age didn't come back significant, right, there is an increase, which means that the females, they did use more, they had a higher emoji frequency, it was just not significant. And then when you see this output, you could go back and think about it again and say, well, maybe that's because the sample size is too small for it to be significant, right? So what if I had 10,000 participants, would it still look like that, or would it then be significant?
What was the p-value on that?
The p-value for that was 0.13, yeah.
So not bad.
Yeah. Interestingly, the non-linear interaction between age and gender was significant, okay? And that's where the curvature comes from, and this is what we saw for extroversion. So this is highly significant. The higher the extroversion, the higher the hashtag frequency. Now this is interesting. This is This is the hashtag density with the emoji density, and you can see that this is just all over the place. Okay, now, and this is where we come back to gender. Given my 22 hypotheses, I had to write out every hypothesis for every of the Luke word categories, right? Now, traditionally, we would say, well, of course, I mean, family words, females are higher. Negative emotion words, maybe males are higher. Occupation words, definitely males are higher. Money words, definitely males are higher. Now, there's a ton of stuff that's significant, but it's all, the reference category is male. Right? So this is going from male to female, and this is a positive increase, which means that for all those traditionally, the categories that are traditionally associated with males, they're all significant for females.
Except what, tentative words, it works backwards.
Yeah, except the tentative words. Yeah, which is also, this is also important because that means that going from male to female, the tentative use actually goes down, and you would expect it to be the other way around. So the females in my study, they just, tipped everything over, which shows, and I can show you a couple of other plots later. The age group, remember, 25 or 26 to 35 was the age group that produced the most tweets for females, okay? Given the times when those age groups tweeted, and this finding that has to do with all those word categories showed that actually females in my sample use Twitter a lot more for professional purposes than the males, okay? Why? Because Twitter is a marketplace where a lot of females, a lot of professional females talk about their job. Okay, so it's and while this is very surprising, if you look at it against the backdrop of a social medium that's used for professional purposes, now it's not so perplexing or surprising that all of a sudden women use more occupation words or more money words because they use Twitter for professional purposes. Otherwise, if that wasn't the case, then you would maybe find, or you would look for something that said the opposite of that, right? Good, and then swear words, so essentially all the word categories that are traditionally associated with males were significantly predicted by females. I mean, that's a very interesting finding, and this is, I don't know if that exists cross-culturally. I haven't found a study that says it, but it's a good linguistic finding because it says this. We know that most stuff is highly context dependent. Okay, you might not find this for Facebook posts from the same females. Okay, so I'm convinced that this has very much to do with the social medium, especially Twitter being non-reciprocal. Twitter also being, you don't have a profile on Twitter, right? So Twitter is about what you have to say and not about who you are. So it doesn't really matter if you're male or female, it's about your message. And that's absolutely represented here. And then you have some models that are just not significant. And age is significant in some of the models, but not in a lot, and that shows that age doesn't really matter, which is that's a good thing on social media, right? Especially for that age bracket, 18 to 45. And this is, word-based measures. I didn't skip that because I didn't talk about that. So we have significant positive correlations for extroversion and agreeableness with positive feeling words, which is that by proxy confirms what research has found before. We have a significant positive correlation between neuroticism and anxiety. That was as expected. We have a significant relationship between sentiment scores and extroversion, which, like you asked before, that confirms somewhat the rich get richer hypothesis, right? So they benefit from social media. We have an absence of a significant negative relationship between sentiment scores and neuroticism, which contradicts previous research, right? Previous research has actually found that sentiment scores and neuroticism are negatively correlated. I confirmed the notion that women are happy across cultures, which shows in the sentiment score, in the higher emoji density, and the positive emotion words. Gender has no bearing on either the frequency of tweets with hashtags or the number of hashtags in the hand-coded subset, right? So the hashtag usage is essentially gender independent. The hashtag usage is evidence for a more content-related tweet behavior for both male and female German Twitter users, which showed in the higher frequency of tag hashtags, right? Which that confirms, one, the end position is preferred, and it also confirms that tag hashtags are used in their canonical sense to index tweets and to be part of a bigger audience. By the way, those findings, if you think about it, when women use Twitter for more professional purposes, right? This is not new. There is linguistic research that shows that women in the workplace, and linguistically you call it community of practice. This is we have known this since the 90s. They use traditionally male language simply because the context demands it, and if you're male or female, you just adapt to the context, okay? We have a more complex, significant linear interaction of gender and age in relationship to emoji density, and gender is a significant predictor for both positive emotion and positive feeling words. Gender also turned out to be a significant predictor for anger words, swear words, tentative words, occupation words, and words related to money, like we saw in the table, essentially, but produced by females instead of males. Now this has some implications for marketing, because that means if you wanted to apply targeted marketing as Twitter in Germany, then you would maybe redirect your marketing in a way that you address professional women and market it as a platform where you could just talk about your work or extend your professional communication. I think it pretty much covered the linguistic implications. That's especially for the word categories. That's something pretty new that hasn't been found previously, and it just confirms that most of the things we talk about and often simplify are highly context dependent and are usually not univariate and not just simple problems. And then there's some cultural implications, which shows that we might not find the same thing if you replicated this study for English tweets. Maybe you don't find the same things, right? Maybe German females behave differently on Twitter than American females. There are some limitations. The Big Five have been criticized sometimes for the simplicity and trying to essentially pack people into categories based on statements that they just have to rank, right? It doesn't change the fact that it's still one of the gold standards for measuring personality. Linguistic and word count has to be criticized simply based on the fact that it's a dictionary-based tool, which comes with its own inherent limitations, especially seeing the German Luke dictionary is from 2001, okay? Which is why those two word categories are still, distinct, and they're still working on the update. But stuff like that is just very slow and sluggish. The sample size could, of course, have been bigger, as is usually the case. I think overall, though, this was fairly representative, and nobody has ever gotten a representative study or sample in the lab. Noisy text normalization, this is something that you could always improve. There's always some feature that you didn't think of or that you didn't put in your algorithm, and then it reduces your accuracy a little bit. And then, of course, Twitter comes with its own problems, right? So you get all the tweets for one participant, but you only get a subset for another participant. What if they changed? What throughout 5 years, they changed the way they write? But that's just, if you don't have full access to Twitter, then there's no way to get like a randomized sample for a participant. My recommendations are to expand research that includes linguistic and word count. It would be nice to have a comparative analysis that essentially is based on the same metrics. Other social media, it would be very interesting to use to essentially look at LinkedIn, right, a professional network, and see what the gender differences are there, because maybe then you don't find any positive emotion words for both genders, right? If it's very matter of fact. Cluster analysis, for example, topic modeling could be done to see if the tweets group together in a certain way that you maybe unexpectedly or confirming the way that you thought they would, and those are my references. And then I think I didn't start this, so you can't see it, but
a couple questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, there are happiness rankings of countries of the world. I think we're now, the United States is at 18.
I'm not surprised.
If you
Is that up or down?
well, we've dropped. But if you did your research in different countries, like women in Saudi Arabia versus women in very egalitarian countries like Germany,
Yeah.
you might find that women in Saudi Arabia aren't as happy, although they just got.
Oh, absolutely. When I said cross-cultural agreement, then I excluded all of those countries essentially, because that's where most of the research is based.
And this next question shows my ignorance. But do you know if somebody read your Twitter statement?
Say what?
If you write a Twitter post, do you know if somebody read it?
No, you can just see if somebody liked it or retweeted it, and you can see the number of interactions, which means that you can see if how many people saw it, but you can't see who saw it.
Oh, okay, because when you said the rich gets richer, you could be writing all the tweets you wanted and no one's reading them. So
yeah, but I mean, then again, writing in itself could be like a, you just cathartic, and then you just write it off your chest. Yes.
Yeah, I think that leads to my question. I'm interested in agenda setting and the use of language. So usually you have the media like setting an agenda through news, then you have popular people like setting an agenda. But you find in Twitter that even people that really don't have like much influence in society post stuff and then they get like much retweeted. So I was wondering, is it because of their use of language? Or could there be like, so I was wondering if there is like any research that has like harvested those kinds of scenarios and then encouraged them to see if they're like recurring patterns.
I'm not aware of that. That would be very interesting, because the interesting thing is that essentially any random person could become viral on Twitter at any given day, or people become viral on Instagram, and then 6 months later they're just gone. But I would definitely say, and this is one of the, I mean, if you think about it, this is one of the big problems we have now. That's, for example, that celebrities have so much influence, and that they have this bullhorn of social media that they didn't have before, and they still had influence before through media, but you could decide not to essentially read garbage newspapers, or you could decide not. But now they have their own platform, and they tweet about anti-vaccination and the dangers of formaldehyde, and that's a big problem. So absolutely, it would be interesting to see how somebody or look at accounts that are verified, right? If you like some personality, or like a journalist for the New York Times, usually you get Twitter's verified stamp, and you get like the blue label with the check mark or whatever. You could focus on only those accounts and see how they use language, for example, and see if that has some impact on how it's perceived. Yeah, I mean, you have to hand filter those people and then stream their accounts, right? Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Good.
So the survey that you had in Qualtrics, what sort of questions did that ask? Was it just like, who are you, where do you live, what's your gender?
What's your account number? I mean, the first thing, how you're supposed to, you ask demographic information last, because people, there's like I think there's even research on how to ask questions in the questionnaire that I haven't read. But but it's important to ask that stuff later. So the first thing they were asked was the BFI-10 inventory, so the personality inventory, right? They get through that fairly quickly, and then they were asked questions like, age, gender, Twitter handle. Some people, and I think I had a very good number of submissions, like 202, that only resulted in 62 valid data sets, because people are asses sometimes. and they wrote at real Donald Trump, or they just left it blank. It said that the consent form that they all hopefully read said you have to provide your Twitter handle, and by the way, your Twitter is public anyways. It didn't mean that they actually, and that was interesting in itself because it shows that Germans apparently didn't have a problem submitting a personality questionnaire, but they did have a problem with that information being linked to their social media account. And Germans are known for having issues with privacy and social media in general, which is why most social media platforms take way longer to take off in Germany than in other countries. But yeah, so essentially standard demographic information, right? Age, gender, zip code. I also asked for a second zip code that was intended, this is important for linguistic analysis, if they live at a place where they hadn't grown up. Right, because your language development stops at some point or slows down, and it's very important because if you're 32 and you move from Bavaria to Berlin, your language is pretty much set in stone, right? If you're 3 years old and you move to Berlin, by the time you're 32, you're going to have a Berlin accent, or you talk like the Berlin person, right? And that's important because that's how language changes. So if that was the case, I actually put I don't know if I have it here. In the dissertation itself, I included a map that it looked the same like the one we saw, but for the people who moved, it had the origin and then an arrow pointing towards where they ended up. Right, so that could be, that shows if somebody, especially for big metropolitan areas. Berlin, for example, is said to have its very own dialect. So if you didn't grow up there, it's very unlikely that you're ever going to adjust or fully, adopt that dialect. Yeah, so stuff like that, and 2 levels of education, and then I think employment. Yeah, pretty standard.
It'd be interesting to see if someone who, intentionally was throwing your results by putting like real Donald Trump, did they fill it out as if they pretended to be Donald Trump, or was it just at the last minute they're like,
highly distorted emotions.
I'm not going to give you my accounts.
No, that was the weird thing. The Twitter handle was the first demographic question, which then I have no explanation for that, because then they took the time to fill out the personality questions, then they put in the weird Twitter handle or left it blank, and then filled out the rest of the questionnaire and submitted it. Okay, which that just shows you didn't read the consent form, because then you would know that without the Twitter handle your data is garbage, right? Yeah. I have no explanation for that.
That's like a whole study in itself. The psychology of people who fill out.
Oh yeah, but you're fighting an uphill battle, I think, because you know how many emails you get here from people asking you for participation, and if it sounds interesting, I do it because if you've been in the same spot, then you know that people need your participation. But if it's just if I've read the same title essentially in 10 different ways, then it's like, okay, just get together in a group and write the same paper. But yeah, you're definitely fighting an uphill battle. Yeah, I also use the website. It's called Survey Circle. It started out in Germany. It's now available in the US, and you can post your survey. And the way it works is a quid pro quo system. So it's other researchers that are also posting surveys, and essentially they fill out your survey and you fill out their survey. Okay, and it's completely okay. The only thing I saw is it's kind of like a rank system, right? So the more surveys you take, the higher your rank becomes, and then the more points people can get by filling out your survey. And that way, sometimes people, and this is where a portion of those people who didn't fill it out completely comes from, is they just filled it out because they wanted to get points to move up the ladder. And while the system seems very good and beneficial for everybody involved, I wrote them an email and said, this is a huge problem. Like, if you want to keep this going, you have to make sure that people then, once they move up, don't get taken advantage of, because they're higher up in the rank, and other people don't just take the survey because they want the points. I didn't get a reply.
There's also a problem of people taking it who actually should be excluded from your group because they don't meet the criteria, but they have incentive to lie.
Yeah.
Because they want their survey to raise.
Yeah. And I went with the assumption that all of those people are in the portion that didn't fill it out completely. Yeah. This is it.